Coming, all right, we're coming to section 12, property inspection and repair. And as you mentioned in the last video, this is where the headaches are. And this is where we need to be super aware. And it's so important. We're actually going to read through it and parse it out because these are important sections for really making sure the deal doesn't fall apart and all parties are protected in it.
Yeah, and usually what happens is the buyer's in love with the property when they submit an offer.
Yeah.
And then 7 days, 10 days goes by, you hire an inspector, inspector comes back and, you know, as everyone does, has to justify their fee, and they find some things wrong with it. And then the buyer's all of a sudden saying, oh, and we also saw another house around the corner. So this is why it's important to understand what's inside of this contract, what the buyer's rights are, what the seller's rights are. So let's start there.
So I'm going to read it. You stop where it needs to be stopped. So buyer shall have, if left blank, 15 days. I like to put in a number instead of leaving blank.
Always.
After effective date. So once again, effective date is once it goes under contract, or you establish what that effective day is.
Yeah, remember, effective date is, and each contract may be a little bit different on the terminology, but usually the effective date is the date of which the last party signs and delivers.
There we go. All right. So that's the inspection period, within which buyer may, at buyer's expense, conduct general wood-destroying organism, WDO, and permit inspections as described below.
So remember, in the general inspection section, I call it general, but in the property inspection, it's probably a better way of saying it, there's always those 3 target items.
Yes.
General, WDO, which is your wood destroying, your pest inspection, and then the permit inspection.
All right. So within that, if buyer fails to timely deliver to seller a written notice, all right, written is not a text. Written is at minimum an email. I don't recommend putting it in a letter in the mail.
Right.
But if you fail to deliver to seller a written notice or report required by B, C, or D, and that's below, then except for seller's continuing maintenance requirement, buyer shall have waived seller's obligation to repair, replace, treat, or remedy the matters not inspected and timely reported.
So this comes to the most important thing when you're dealing with properties is to have a folder or a calendar in your phone or on a computer. Soon as you get an effective date, you need to go through the entire contract and figure out what are all the time frames, the deadlines, because even though it's not your responsibility to remind a grown adult who's over the age of 18 who just signed a contract for $900,000 that they have to have certain things done by certain times. They will certainly blame you if they miss. And what this says, even if the seller agreed to fix up to $5,000, if you didn't get your report done and submitted to the seller within the time frame, guess what? It's gone.
Yeah. They are no longer obligated. If this contract does not close, buyer shall repair all damage to property resulting from buyer's inspections, return property to its pre-inspection condition, and provide seller with paid receipts for all work done on property upon its completion.
Yeah, I'll give you one story and scroll back up. I don't know if they can see that, but if the contract does not close, buyer shall repair all damage to the property resulting from buyer's inspection. So we had one where the backyard deck, was infested with termites, but you didn't know that because they were eating it from the inside out. The buyer's inspector goes out there and starts poking at the 4x4s, and the whole entire wood fell apart. And the seller said, hey, guess what? You're now going to repair my whole entire deck because you've caused damage, and it can't be put in the way it was or returned. So I don't know what to tell you. Just be aware that weird stuff can happen out there, but to the best of their ability, even with, let's say, drywall. I mean, if you're poking through and there's termite damage or there's wood rot, sometimes when it's the whole iceberg logic.
Yeah.
You're poking the top, but below it is a huge mass of problems.
Yeah.
Doesn't happen too often, but again, beware.
Yeah. All right, so now we come to this section, which is general property inspection and repair. And this is really looking at the inspection. We're going to look at the general inspection and then the property condition and then the property repair. So let's dive into this. Those items specified in 12B and or 2 below, which seller is obligated to repair or replace. Keep in mind, this is where you had negotiated earlier in the contract those repair limits, general repair, WDO, pulled permits, or permit inspection, says they may be inspected, general inspection, by a person who specializes and holds an occupational license if required by law to conduct home inspections, or who holds a Florida license to repair and maintain items, a professional inspector. Let's stop here.
So also, I'll say this over and over. Not all contracts have this language. So you have to be aware that this one says anybody that's going out there, either if it's required to have a license, then they have to have one. A lot of times you may be dealing with somebody whose neighbor, buddy, dad is a contractor in Georgia or whatever. So again, is it your job to go back and do due diligence to verify whether the inspector themselves are licensed or not? Usually what you're going to want to do is have like a team of 3 possible inspection companies, and that's who you're going to give the information to your client and say, whether you use the word recommend or not, it's up to you. But here's who we've used in the past. Consider this. Now, every once in a while, you're going to get faced with somebody saying, hey, my brother builds houses all the time. I want him to come out and do this. If you're running into that situation and the seller then pops up and says, I want to see what their qualifications are, then it may not comply. And don't forget, let's say this conversation never happens and the brother does the inspection, you submit, or the buyer submits the report to the seller, and the seller looks at it and goes, this is on somebody's Microsoft Word document. This isn't a licensed inspector. And now guess what? You're past the time frame.
And yeah, you're in trouble. You've lost out.
You've now waived the right because the buyer did not follow the terms of the contract.
Yeah. So in this, and this is important in juxtaposition to the as-is contract, which says you can inspect and at your sole discretion. This is coming in and saying licensed if required. And the best remedy of that is use a local licensed inspector so those issues don't pop up. Now we come to buyer shall, within the inspection period, inform seller or of any general repair items that are not in the condition required by B2 below by delivering to seller a written notice, not text, email, and upon written request by seller, a copy of the portion of professional inspector's written report dealing with such items.
Yeah, so here's where some dilemmas start to occur. The easy way to do it is you just forward the whole report and say, see report, and we want everything fixed. The problem with that as a seller, so if you're representing sellers, you don't want to see the whole report. You just want to know, what does buyer want fixed?
Yeah.
Once that report has been given to you, if this buyer decides they want to back out of the contract and you have to now relist it again, you now have personal knowledge of all the things that inspector, right or wrong, correct or not correct, has now alleged is wrong with the house, and you must now disclose those. Otherwise, you could potentially be sued for non-disclosure.
Right. So it's better at this point to just pull that section out. At minimum, just use the summary section. And I like to, on those repair addendums, highlight and restate, go to this section, this point in the paper or in the report, and instead of just sending it over and letting them go on a scavenger hunt through the report to find it. Specificity works. Okay. So property condition. The following items shall be free of leaks, water damage, or structural damage. Of course, the ceiling, roof, including fascia and soffits, exterior and interior walls, doors, windows, and foundation. The above items, together with pool equipment, and non-leased major appliances, heating, cooling, mechanical, electrical, security, sprinkler, septic, and plumbing systems, and machinery, seawalls, dockage, watercraft lifts, and related equipment are and shall be maintained until closing, in working condition defined below.
Yeah, so essentially, in the past, none of this was in there.
Yeah.
And then we'd have to guess, what were they talking about? What has to be free of leaks? And I think as we go down, we'll probably see windows in here, because The never answered question in the past, and when I say past, I've been doing this since 99. So from 99 to maybe 2018, if you had a double pane window and it was fogged, the seller would say it is working in the condition because the second pane is stopping the moisture from getting inside, but the first pane has failed because it's fogged.
Yeah.
And I think they finally clarified that, but usually all of those listed items are now in there because in the past it's been a bone of contention between buyers and sellers, so they've listed them, which makes your job a little bit easier because now you can just say, let's read the contract. Is it covered?
I love that. What does the contract say?
Right.
So torn screens, including pool and patio screens, fogged windows, and missing roof tiles or shingles shall be repaired or replaced by seller prior to closing.
Okay, so hold on a second, because this is always, I think I do a different seminar on this one. If you have a torn screen, seller's required to replace it. So let's say the house has multiple screens that are torn, and the seller says, I don't want to replace those. From the listing agent standpoint, you say, then tear all your screens down.
Yeah.
And guess what? There are no screens anywhere.
That's right.
Or the seller's going to have to fix all the screens, which really isn't a big cost. But I always thought that was interesting how it doesn't address if it was completely missing.
Right.
If it's torn, got to replace it. But
Yeah, there you go. You're not required to have screens, but if they're not in a proper condition, they must be repaired. All right, so let's keep going here. Seller is not required to repair or replace cosmetic conditions defined below unless the cosmetic conditions resulted from a defect in an item seller is obligated to repair or replace. So working condition means operating in the manner in which the item was designed to operate.
all right, hold on a second though. So cosmetic, which we just went over there.
Yeah.
I mean, truly the purpose of that is when you're purchasing a house, even a brand new one, it's done by individuals. It's not like your car that went through a factory and it comes out pristine. There's going to be dings, nicks, pinholes, and things like that. So the purpose of this section isn't to identify every single imperfection in the property. It's to say there's going to be cosmetics things which doesn't affect like if you have drywall and there's a scratch in it, well, the drywall's still doing its thing.
Yeah.
The scratch isn't going to affect the working condition. So now they're going to go into the definition of the working condition.
Yeah. So cosmetic condition or work. Let's go here. Working condition means operating in the manner in which the item was designed to operate. Water heaters, air conditioners.
And the big one that I see with this one, air condition. Every time the air condition. So in the past, for my agents, I've always said when your buyer hires an inspector, they need to appreciate the difference between I recommend replacing the air condition versus the air condition is not working.
Yes.
So what we see a lot is on a 12-year-old house, the air condition's on its last leg, I recommend replacing it. Well, guess what that means? It's working in the condition it was meant to because he didn't say it wasn't.
Right.
So understand the nuances.
Very good. Very good. Cosmetic conditions means aesthetic imperfections that do not affect working condition of the item, including but not limited to pitted marcite, tears, worn spots and discoloration of floor coverings, wallpapers or window treatments, nail holes, scrapes, scratches, dents, chips, or caulking in ceilings, walls, flooring, tile, fixtures or mirrors, and minor cracks in walls, floor tiles, windows, driveways, sidewalks, pool decks, and garage and patio floors. These are not things that you come back to and say you must fix.
Right. And they use terms like minor cracks.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know the distance in a crack from a minor to a major, but traditionally, if you do have a home inspector, they will tell you, if it's a driveway and the crack is more than a certain amount of millimeters or whatever it is, then it's a problem. So
yeah. All right. And finally, just to wrap up this section, cracked roof tiles, curling or worn shingles, or limited roof life shall not be considered defects. Seller must repair or replace so long as there's no evidence of actual leaks, leakage, or structural damage.
unless the buyer's using a lender and the roof is more than 16 years old, even though it has a 25-year life, then it's going to become an issue. So
Because the financing will not go through.
that is correct.
All right, here's what's important about knowing all of this. As you're talking if you're working with the buyer and you're talking with the buyer, a lot of times they want to throw in cosmetic issues. And this is where we point out the inspection is for working condition, not cosmetic. Doesn't mean that you can't possibly negotiate some of those things. However, the seller is not obligated to repair cosmetic issues.
Correct.
All right, now we get into repairs. This is important, very important, and here's why it's important. As Mark said, sometimes you lose a little bit of the in love after the inspection. And you've negotiated repair limits. If it goes over, the buyer may still be required to buy it, even if they've fallen out of love, if the seller's willing to fix it. So let's dig into this. Seller is only obligated to make such general repairs as are necessary to bring items into condition specified above. Seller shall, within 10 days after receipt of buyer's written notice or general inspection report, either have reported repairs to general repair items completed at seller's expense or have repairs estimated by an appropriately licensed person and a copy delivered to buyer, or have a second inspection made by a professional inspector and provide a copy of such report and estimates of repairs to buyer. If buyers and sellers' inspection reports differ and the parties cannot resolve the differences, buyer and seller together shall choose and equally split the cost of a third professional inspector whose written report shall be binding on the parties.
So in reality, buyer starts first. They hire an inspector. Inspector comes back with a laundry list of items and says, okay, according to me, these are all the things that need to be addressed. And understand, we now have a ping pong of time events.
Yeah.
So you have to know, when did the buyer send the report or information to the seller? Because from that moment in time, the seller then will have 10 days to do something. So everything shifts to the seller. So for your file, you need to make sure you have documented what day we have complied with. The buyer has sent the information to the seller, and then go out 10 days and then put on your calendar when the seller should respond. Most of the time, the seller is not going to hire their own inspector to go out there and double check stuff. The seller is going to do one of two things. Look at the list and go, what do you want me to fix? Or look at the list and say, you're absolutely nuts, and I'm not fixing any of this stuff.
There you go.
So I've since I've been doing this, I don't think I've ever heard of them hiring a third professional inspector because they couldn't agree on the terms.
Yeah, but that's a mechanism that you need to be aware of. If cost to repair general items equals or is less than the general repair limit negotiated, seller shall have repairs made in accordance with paragraph 12F.
Right, and from a legal standpoint, anytime you see the word shall, that means must.
Must.
When you see may, that means
option.
Right, correct.
If cost to repair general repair items exceeds the general repair limit, then within 5 days after a party's receipt of the last estimate, here are the options. A, seller may elect to pay the excess by delivering written notice to buyer.
All right, we'll stop there. So even if it exceeds it.
Yeah, we've got a 2,000 limit, comes back 4,000.
How about stucco? $20,000, and the seller says, I got this.
Yeah.
No matter how much the buyer doesn't like it because now they think the house is a piece of trash, if the seller does it, then the buyer still, at least at this moment in time, is obligated to go through with the closing.
There we go. All right. B, buyer may deliver written notice to the seller designating which repairs of general repair items seller shall make at a total cost to the seller not exceeding the limit, and agreeing to accept the balance of general repair items in their as-is condition, subject to seller's continuing maintenance requirement.
That's just basically the buyer saying, fix these items, they total $2,000, and
I'll take on the rest.
that is correct.
So option one is seller says, look, I'll cover it all. The buyer says, you cover up to the limit, I'll cover the rest. And now we come to the last little section, and it says, if neither party delivers such written notice to the other, then either party may terminate this contract, and buyer shall be refunded the deposit, thereby releasing the buyer and seller from all further obligations under this contract.
Right. So in other words, It's a default provision that, let's say the buyer submits a laundry list of items they want the seller to fix. Seller never responds or anything like that after a 5-day window, a period of time. Then the buyer finally has a right to say, well, then I'm canceling. Whereas if the buyer submits it and the seller says, oh, no, I'm fixing it all, then the buyer's still obligated under the terms of the contract.
There you go. All right, so that's the thing. We're going to pause here. We'll come back in the next video and talk about wood destroying organisms, the inspection and repair. It's very similar, but we're going to dig into that. But the biggest takeaway here is you've got the limits and what the options are. Know this point. And from a working with buyer standpoint, I always prepare the buyer in advance. Hey, if it goes over the limit, even if you fall out of love, if the seller agrees to repair, you must buy or you are in breach and you would forfeit your earnest money.
Correct.
All right, we'll be back.